delighted to be joined by California Representative Barbara Lee, who's been fighting in Congress for racial equality and community investments instead of increased policing and military spending since her election in 1998. Last month, Representative Lee introduced the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Resolution. In the midst of protests and demonstrations nationwide against police killings, worldwide, including the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and too many others. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Resolution calls on Congress to propose legislation that would create a United States Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. The commission would be tasked with permanently eliminating racial inequities. This commission would scale up a model created in 2016 that included more than 150 experts and 40 community groups, and itself expanded on years of work with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The program was designed by our guest, Dr. Gail Christopher, Executive Director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity. We also have with us Harris County Commissioner Rachael Ellis, who has called for community investments, racial healing, and reconciliation, notably this past Juneteenth. The approach we're going to be talking about examines how societies have created a hierarchy of human value, placing the worth of white people above all others, and subsequently, this approach makes localized recommendations. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission would interview communities impacted by white supremacy, people whose ancestors were slaves or whose territory was unilaterally annexed by the United States, like Puerto Rico or Hawaii, or who were otherwise subject to race-based discrimination by US government action. So let's talk about it. Thank you for joining us, Representative Lee. Can you please tell us what you're hoping this commission will do and why you picked this model?
Inviting me to be with you, but also I just want to acknowledge the other two panelists who I've known for many, many years. First, Rachael Ellis, who, boy, we met in the day when he was working for the great late Congressman Mickey Leland. And it's so good to see him still on the battleground and still fighting for racial justice and equity. Also, Gail Christopher, who really gave us the framework and the brilliance and the messaging and the purpose and the really roadmap for what we have introduced as the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. We've worked on this for at least 3 years, and Gail has been such a part of the brain trust, really, of a variety of individuals who really came together to help us put this legislation together. So first of all, the United States has never had a truth-telling moment as it relates to racism. And I think what we decided, this was years ago, was that the United States needed to come to grips, tell the story, put into historical context systemic racism. And what I mean by that is when you look at over 40 countries, they've established truth commissions to really address the atrocities of their countries, genocide, crimes against humanity, slavery, you just name it. The United States has never done that. And you have to do that in order to move to the healing, to the healing process, and then to the transformation, which really means here in this country, addressing systemic racism by deconstructing those racist policies and constructing and bringing forth a transformational public and private policy and funding priorities agenda. And so why are we doing this? Because it is so important, especially in this moment. And we weren't sure when we were going to introduce it, but when COVID-19, for example, hit us all, we saw, and we know still today, African Americans being disproportionately impacted by the transmission of the virus and the deaths. And a lot of people didn't quite understand, how is this? I mean, I come from Oakland and Berkeley, California. How is this possible in this year? And I'm saying, what do you mean? Don't you understand these disparities in healthcare? This is just an example, which is another example of 401 years ago and those chains that haven't been broken. And so there's a direct connection between Mr. Floyd's murder and police murders and the wage gap and the wealth gap and the health indices in the African American community and the Middle Passage and slavery. And so we decided we would introduce this bill resolution during this period so that we could begin to educate and begin to beat that drum about the historical context for what is taking place today. Now, I've known this, and many African Americans understand this, but it's never been brought to the American public for a reckoning and for a truth-telling moment where the ancestors of enslaved people and Native Americans come before a commission and tell their stories so that the country can say, okay, we got it, and let's move on. Finally, I'll just say, and I want to thank Gail for her real insight into insisting that we call this truth, racial healing, and transformation instead of reconciliation. Most countries, or many countries, call their truth-telling bodies reconciliation. Well, she, in such a very powerful way, reminded us that there's really nothing to reconcile in America as it relates to the Native American community, African American community, and those communities that have been really enslaved in many ways since our existence here in America. So that's why we're doing it. We have 137 co-sponsors. We're building co-sponsorship support. So I hope that those of you who are listening and watching insist that your members of Congress sign on as a co-sponsor. Thank you again.
Thank you. So you talked about this reckoning. Can you break down what this reckoning would look like? Like, how would this commission work? Can you provide a bit more detail about what we would see if this passes?
Sure. And we're building the framework for the commission. And of course, we don't want this under Trump, right? So we're making sure that we get the resolution passed. And the commission will be determined based on how it will be comprised of activists and people who are descendants of slaves, and also people who have been victimized by the years of oppression and enslavement in the African American community and in other communities. And so we'd have a commission, and I would hope, and we're going to work through how it would work, but we want it also to be decentralized. It'll be a national commission, but Gail has worked for so many years on local efforts. So we would want to feed into the local efforts and really have people come before the commission and talk about their family history and how this really affects them today, whether they've been able to purchase a house or not, or what are the results of 401 years in terms of lynching, in terms of the Black codes, in terms of segregation. So we have to draw that link, and so we have to form the commission in a way where we know that the outcome is going to be some serious recommendations. It's not just to educate the public. This is so we can really move forward with recommendations, and so we have to have a commission that has activists, academics, historians in a variety of disciplines who really want to get to the bottom of these crimes against humanity and then move forward. And also an outcome could be, I support HR 40. And so reparations is a key part of this. And so Congresswoman Jackson Lee and myself, we don't want people to get confused about this, because these two bills go hand in hand as it relates to reparations and what the transformation for African Americans and people of color would be.
Thanks so much. There was a webinar yesterday where professors from UCLA Law's Critical Race Studies program were talking about a lot of these issues and this idea of 400 years of oppression, right? And this idea that there were injunctions, right? So every movement served as an injunction, a pause on at least some of the inequality, but never this idea of redistribution. So I like the idea of thinking about this in partnership with, okay, once we have this healing, what do we do next in order to actually consider like these systems and how to create more equality? So I appreciate that, and let's definitely come back to some of those topics. I'd like to bring in Dr. Gail Christopher. Can you give us a little bit of background about the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission that you put together in 2016? What were you trying to do, and what did you accomplish? Oh, you're muted.
I must acknowledge your leadership and certainly the brilliance and courage of Congresswoman Barbara Lee and all of those who are stepping up into this space and who know that this work has to happen. It's a privilege for me to be here on this panel. I want to say that, we were watching all the murders. This is not new, right? This has been going on for so many years. And we were attempting to work with communities that were embracing the idea of racial healing, but this idea is trying to deal with that tension that you just pointed out between the healing work, the acknowledgement work, the narrative work, and the structural change. So what we've created in TRHT is a framework for action that many communities are using around the country and many campuses are using. And that framework is what's important because it starts with narrative change. We have told a big lie that has persisted in terms of this hierarchy of human value. So we have to be committed to undoing and changing that narrative and telling the truth of our equality and equity as human beings. And we have to learn to see each other without that perception. The other piece of the framework is building the relationships, building the critical mass, the public will, because you have to have that in a democracy. We can't allow this to continue to be politicized and be a source of division. And that's why it's so important that it be done in concert with HR 40. People have to understand the need for HR 40 and the need for reparations, and that work comes out of this. But once we have we're dealing with the narrative and the new stories, we're dealing with the expanding the circles, then we have to say, well, if this lie of human hierarchy has existed for 400 years, how has that been allowed to be? And that takes us to the other three pieces of the framework. The principal tool of maintaining racial hierarchy is separation. Everything from residential segregation to the cradle to prison pipeline to Native American reservations to immigration policy, separation is the principal tool of maintaining that fallacy, right? And so we have to come up with ways to address that structural reality and change it. The other piece of the framework is the law. As you see in the criminal justice system, in the policing, even in our Constitution, the idea of racial hierarchy is built into our legal system. And then the fifth part of the framework is the economy. Above all else, racial hierarchy is a tool that fuels our economy at all levels. So we created this framework and invited communities to use that framework to do their work, to chart their course forward. And that's what's happening around the country, but we always knew that it had to be done at a national level. One of the collaborators with Congresswoman Lee's effort, Marcus, the professor, he reminds us that we don't have a historic archive of the truth in this country. We really don't. When we built the museum on the mall, this finally, almost 400 years later, but there's so much more that needs the record, the public record needs to exist. So those are all aspects of the transformation that we seek, but it's dealing with racism itself and its consequences. Neither the Civil War nor the Civil Rights Movement took on racism. We took on the consequences of it and the manifestations of it. But we as a country have to jettison the permission to continue to oppress. And that's the consciousness shift that the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work knows is fundamental to bringing about the behavior shifts and sustaining them and not allowing this to continue to be a political discussion. It is so much more than that.
Thank you so much. How do we get past it becoming a political discussion? Sometimes it feels like we're further and further apart. There's a divide, right? And we have someone, every day that's trying to make us more divided. Can you talk about, ways in which you've seen like real transformation?
I'm amazed, and we have to go back to the images we saw that were global in nature this was the biggest demonstration of people standing up for humanity, standing up for compassion and fairness in response to the killing of George Floyd. So people's hearts were in that game. They stood up and marched with others. And so part of how we make this not a political discussion is we expand the circles of engagement in the work. Everybody has something to lose if we let racism continue, and COVID-19 has shown us that. The disparities exist, but if the hospitals have no more room for any patients, so we are realizing through COVID-19 that we are interconnected in this society and we are interdependent. And so part of this work is to bring home that reality to people so that they feel the necessity of doing this work out of compassion, but also out of enlightened self-interest. And the key to keeping it from being limited to a political discussion is to have a large enough mass of people that we transcend the politics. And that's what we're working to do.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Ellis, I'd like to bring you into this conversation and talk about, continue talking about this transformation. You've called for racial healing this past Juneteenth. Can you talk a little bit about, what kind of policies you believe will bring about racial healing?
It's a privilege to be with you again. I know you, I got to remember to unmute it.
Are you good?
Okay. Can you imagine? The two politicians didn't unmute. That says something powerful about Congresswoman and me. But look, I want to say it's a privilege to be with you again. I know about your listening audience. You guys have about 100,000 people who are listening. And I always tell my staff, they're not just my friends. The other folks I got to persuade as well. But look, I'm from the Congressman Ron Dellum's Mickey Leland School of Politics. And I knew the Congresswoman back when she was a staffer on Capitol Hill. I think I got there in 81. She'd already been there about 4 years, and she has mentored me over the years. Dr. Christopher, I have known of you for a long time. It's a privilege to get to know you. But look, we've been here before, and I don't know how long this will last. I hope it lasts for a long time. Since we're the hotbed now here in Houston and Harris County, we've done 2 socially distanced demonstrations. We did one at NRG Stadium right by the old Astrodome. Our local activist, Bishop James Dixon, was out there. He had Mayor Turner, Sheila Jackson, and all of us on the stage. Luckily, none of us got COVID, but we probably had 400 people in cars, and they'd blow their horns if something was said that they agreed with. Then we did one at the courthouse talking about bail reform the other day. So when I was asked to do an op-ed in the Washington Post about the significance of Juneteenth, in the spirit of seizing the moment, I figured I got to make this relevant somehow. I've gone full circle on Juneteenth. Congresswoman, by the way, is from Texas originally, from El Paso. So that's mainly a Texas thing. And I remember being in law school. I think Mickey Leland was in Congress. It was his first session. And I was in law school in Austin, and the bill passed, and I was a little angry because I figured, wait a minute, we're going to celebrate finding out that we're free 2.5 years later, and you could get two crops of cotton a year if in Texas, if you were smart. So that's 5 more crops, and we're going to celebrate this? Come on now. Emancipation Proclamation, I think, was New Year's Day, if I'm not mistaken. And then we find it out 2.5 years later in Texas. But over time, it has evolved. Juneteenth, I think, is not so much an opportunity to celebrate how far we have come, but to reflect on how much farther we have to go. So when we wrote that op-ed, I wanted to weave in George Floyd's murder. I wanted to weave in other disparities and make the case. Yeah, make it a national holiday, but in some ways, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, a way to have a discussion about the truth, racial healing, and transformation. Now, the first time I heard of this concept, we have some mutual friends who were real active in the movement, Jerry Dunphy and Nadine Hack. I went to one of those Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings in South Africa when President Clinton was in office. And it was the one where Bishop Tutu, who was the chair, co-chair of it, he cried. We went to some little rural town. We drove from his home, Bishop's Court in Cape Town, about 2 hours, a little town like Andy Mayberry, RFD. And I learned something, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, that in the rural areas where you didn't get the attention, like being in Detroit or Chicago or Joburg or Cape Town, you end up over in some little place like Visalia, you know what I mean? Or Pedo, Texas. That's where you could really do outrageous things. And the concept there was you'd get immunity from prosecution if you admitted what you did in public. And this was a case where I think a white officer talked about how he tortured and mutilated someone. and killed them. And Bishop Tutu cried before it was over with. The victims cried. The perpetrator cried. Hell, we were all crying. But in some ways it was cleansing. But when you ask me about policies, I saw where several prosecutors around the country, progressive prosecutors, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, was setting up similar commissions to talk about criminal justice reforms. And I leaped and I was going to put it on the agenda, but I called some of your colleagues with the Justice Collaborative. And I said, before I go do this, I want to have thought it out. And they said, well, you got to make sure whoever controls it is not someone who's just going to whitewash or sugarcoat history and abuses. And then after you do the study, you got to have some substantive things you do that matter. So I'm going to wait a couple of weeks before I decide what to do. I'm going to talk to my colleagues on the panel with me today, because you have to have substance. Now, during this moment, we ought to put out everything we can, because everybody is conscious of disparities. But then I want to figure out before the light turns off, we get focused on a hurricane, a war, or another pandemic. I want to make sure I got some substantive stuff. We just got our disparity study back for minority and women-owned businesses, which shows 0.5% of the $5 billion a year my county spends, maybe about $200 million less than the city of Houston. City spends about $5.2 billion a year. County spends $5 billion. Less than 5%, 0.5, not 1%, 0.5% of business goes to Black-owned businesses. So now we're going to structure a program. It's just coincidental because it takes 2 years to do a disparity study. So I close on this. Congresswoman Lee and Dr. Christopher, in addition to this body to look at historical wrongs, obviously as policymakers, you talked about the reparations resolution by Congresswoman Jackson Lee. We ought to grab as much as we can, get as much passed as we can, no chokehold, whatever it is, while the eyes of the world are focused on disparities, because I have no idea how long it'll last.
You got me fired up. Representative Lee, how do we capture this moment? We don't know how long this is going to last.
Well, I think, Rodney really laid it out, and we have to do everything we can do right now. Seize the time. That was the title of Bobby Seale's book, Black Panther Party Chairman, Seize the Time. And I think what everyone is doing is seizing the time. And so whatever space we find ourselves in, we have to lift up how we break the chains that have been with us for the last 400 years, manifested in systemic racism. Let me give you one example. I serve as an appropriator. I'm on the Appropriations Committee. And of course, we fund the government. And I'm on the subcommittee on agriculture, labor, health, education, and human services, and the subcommittee on state and foreign operations. The prism I've always looked at, and everyone kind of looks at me when I say it, but this has been like 15 years, is systemic racism. Is this funding going to help close the health disparities at NIH? Okay, and why are we not funding the Office of Minority Health? Don't you guys understand, by funding this account and not by funding the Health Disparities Office, this is a reflection of systemic racism, because what you're doing is not allowing for health disparities to be closed. So I think wherever we are, we need to raise up examples, because so many people are so unconscious of what this is about. I come again from the Bay Area, and very progressive white people. And they called me all the time and couldn't figure out why we were seeing so many, Black folks dying and contracting the viruses. They couldn't understand that, as I said. And so I think we need to take these moments to say those words, to tell the truth, and don't sweep systemic racism, don't sweep racism, don't sweep white supremacy under the rug. Call it like it is. Let's begin this process of truth-telling wherever we find ourselves. Fortunately, I'm in the Congress, and I can just keep beating everybody up about, say the word, say this is racist. We're involved in all kinds of issues now, and sometimes my colleagues like to dance around saying racism, but I think that's the first thing we have to do, is speak the truth, call it out, and then educate people about how their vote, if you're an elected official, or how what they're saying or or the decisions that they're making contribute to or begin to deconstruct racism?
Thank you so much. So first of all, I'm in Long Beach, California, so I feel like we're cousins. Second, is House leadership supportive of it? You mentioned your colleagues, are they coming around and starting to speak differently and can we get some action?
I have never heard my colleagues say Black Lives Matter so much in my life. So yes, they're hearing us at least. And I thank and give all credit to young people who are insisting that they hear us. And so now I don't see as much reluctance to call a spade, to say, yeah, this is a reflection of racism. Or yes, we have to put more funding on the front end in terms of nonprofits to begin to heal our communities rather than in policing. And so I'm beginning to hear them say that, yeah. Now, when it comes to their votes, some members in certain Trump districts may be reluctant, but I think that's going to be up to the movement to make sure that members who want to vote the correct way are undergirded and know that the movement is behind them, and to help them understand that what Trump stands for is not what Black Lives Matter stands for. And so I see the broadening of the discussion and the more forthright language that we're using. And also in terms of just inviting guests to our Democratic Caucus meetings and our message meetings, we broadened the spectrum of who we invite. And Dr. Christopher, I want to make sure you have a chance to come to talk to the Democratic Caucus. We had Brian Stevenson talk about lynching and the Peace and Justice Museum in Alabama and the Lynching Museum and the patent and what has happened from the Middle Passage to today as manifested in mass incarceration. So I do see my colleagues really broadening their awareness and being not as resistant to what we in the Black Caucus have been talking about since its inception 49 years ago.
Now, I know we have to close soon, but Dr. Christopher, I'd like to bring you back in. So, a lot of us are impatient. We've seen this story play out over and over again. What do you say to, a lot of people in the movement who say, we want justice now. Like, we don't, like we're done with this. We know what the problem is. What advice and what counsel would you give the movement, and how do we go about this? And like I said, make sure we're not losing this momentum.
I think it's very important to recognize what the problem is. We can come up with solutions to the consequences of the problem, but the problem is racism. The problem is the permission to devalue people. And so we have to take today's technology, today's communications capacity, today's momentum, and we have to shift the collective understanding of that is a lie. It just has no truth. Science tells us that, anthropology tells us that, and yet we still let it continue to live in the minds and the hearts of people who have authority. And so that's why this piece of the work is different. It's one thing to have a policy shift, but if a new political party comes in and reverses that policy shift, and we could list 100 of them, we continue to be in this circle. So we have to do the real long-term work of digging deep and changing the consciousness and making it no longer permissible to build a society and sustain a society on the lie of human value hierarchy. And to keep that focus on the work, there are a million policies that we have to change, but we have to not just reform these systems, we have to transform them because they're no longer built on the fallacy and on the lie. And I think that's the message we have, and the young people get that. I mean, when they march and say Black Lives Matter, they get the fact that they are countering the fallacy that says that our lives don't matter, That's what Dr. King said with the signs, I am a man. But we have to really drive this home in every textbook, in every system, in the library. Libraries are a major partner in this work. The humanities councils are partners. The media has to be partners. I mean, this has to be an all-out transformation of our infrastructure as a society and we'll see some immediate results, and then generations in the future will see results. But I think we have to make sure people understand the scale of the work.
Yeah, thank you so much. You always say that change comes, when we build new models. So looking forward to that.
That's true. Not tinkering around the old models. We got to create new models to make the old models obsolete. Absolutely. And that idea is obsolete.
Yeah, and we have to recognize that this is a marathon, and this is our part, of the marathon that we have to run because, on behalf of our ancestors, but on behalf of the future generations.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate all of your time. I really enjoyed this. And if there's a barbecue, social distancing, I want to be invited.
Eat fish.
Yeah, Texas
better barbecue that fish.
It's gotta be Texas barbecue now.
Yeah.
All right. You guys have you all have a great day, and we'll be back in the briefing soon.